Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ASCE webinar series. Today we have we hope it's going to be a great presentation by Luis Gil Abinader. Is that how you pronounce the last?
Abinader, that's
Abinader. Okay. Who's a senior researcher at the Knowledge Ecology International, a nonprofit based in Washington, working on access to medicines and vaccines. He's been particularly involved in COVID, which of course is a major issue, but there is an international movement going on to try to allow for better access to medicines in general, especially for the third world. Prior to joining KEI, Luis worked as a fellow for the International Centre of Studies in Science, Technology, and Innovation in Argentina, KBN. Jay. I did my research and my PhD in Argentina.
Yeah, I have a master's from the Latin American Faculty of Social Science.
I'm going to get to that.
Yeah.
He received his law degree from the Pontificia, Universidad Católica, Madre, Maestra in the Dominican Republic, and a master's in intellectual property from the Latin American School of Social Sciences in Argentina. Excuse me. So, with that introduction, and before I cough my way through the rest of the presentation, I'm going to turn you over to Luis. All yours.
Thank you, Gary. I suppose you can hear me now.
Loud and clear.
And I suppose you can see my screen now. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. And my presentation will be about scaling up the manufacture of the Cuban vaccines. And like Gary said, I've been working on Knowledge Ecology International on issues related to access to medicine. Because I am not an expert on Cuban issues, or rather not even Latin American issues in general, I thought it was useful for me to give, just to spend a couple of minutes explaining what are the typical questions that I normally work on in my research. And so I think there are two big set of questions that I typically work on. On the one hand, I spend a lot of time thinking about the political economy of research and innovation. So I'm interested in policies that shape public and private research and development collaborations. And so in particular, I look at funding agreements by which governments in general, and with an emphasis of the US government, finance research and development projects. I'm interested in questions related to how much money the government invests in research and development. And I do this more than a macro level, and on a very specific product level, where I look into specific drugs or vaccines and try to understand how much actual money went from the government to the development of those products. Based on the understanding that if the public invests money in the development of a particular drug, the public should have a stake in the access and affordability of those products. I'm also interested in understanding why and how publicly funded research is often privatized through mechanisms like patents and intellectual property in general. The public funding was was the incentive in a lot of cases to develop this product. So why would we also need patents on top of that public funding? That's a question that I ask. And more recently this year, I've been increasingly interested in the idea of developing manufacturing capacity in low and middle income countries. What we've been seeing during the pandemic is that a lot of countries have manufacturing capacity that is not being used to produce vaccines because of intellectual property and know-how hoarding. But also another question is, can those countries develop further manufacturing capacity and research and development capacity? So I'm interested in that question too. And the other set of questions that I'm typically working on relates to the political economy of intellectual property. So I'm interested in international norms that regulate the ownership of knowledge. So in particular, the World Trade Organization agreements on intellectual property, the TRIPS agreement, and bilateral agreements related to intellectual property. I'm typically interested in how they're negotiated and what are the provisions that they include and what flexibilities they allow for. I'm interested in national policies related to how patents are granted. Patents are monopolies, and monopolies should not be, legal monopolies should not be granted unless it's completely necessary. In national offices that work, that grant patents, there are typically abuses from the pharmaceutical industry, which typically try to obtain and expand the scope of the monopolies that they get. And so I'm interested in understanding those abuses and highlighting those abuses. I'm interested in the transfer of knowledge through licensing agreement, and in particular, knowledge that was owned by or that is owned by universities or governments and transferred to the private sector to those technology transfer contracts. And all of these questions that I typically work on are on the umbrella of access and affordability, right? Specifically on that assumption that when there are when there are monopolies and the number of companies that can manufacture products in general, but particularly health product, drugs and vaccines, and the competition is restricted, that typically allows the companies that hold the monopoly the ability to increase prices, and that limits access and affordability. So those are the things that I normally work on. And the last year, or rather the last 7 months or so, I've been interested in this, which is the Cuban vaccine. One of the Cuban vaccines are currently in development, and people like him, Vicente Vélez Bencomo, who is the director of the Finland Institute. And the reason why I'm interested in this issue is basically because I want to understand how that relates to global access to vaccines in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there are three main questions that I've been working on with regards to the Cuban vaccine. Why did a country that is a relatively small country in the Caribbean that faces their own challenges in a number of issues like the embargo, but also in economic crisis that are connected in a large way to the embargo, and other challenges? Why did they decide to work on a vaccine of their own as opposed to maybe buy vaccines from China or Russia, or try to get them from some of their other allies? So that's one of the questions that intrigues me about the Cuban vaccines. I'm also interested in why, how Cuba was able to quickly move from the idea of developing vaccines to starting clinical development, which happened, I will explain now, in about 3 or 4 months. I'm interested in understanding whether Cuba can distribute their vaccines globally, and whether they want to do that, and whether that is actually possible. And those are the questions that I'm gonna be addressing during this presentation today. Let's start with the first one, which is the motivations that Cuba has to develop their own vaccines. I've identified 3 main motivations for this. The first one is that Cuba already has, prior to the pandemic, they had research and development capabilities to develop vaccines. So a number of countries in Latin America have one of the 3 main pillars, or 3 main things that you need to develop a vaccine, the full cycle locally, which is basic science, clinical testing, and manufacturing capacity. So Argentina, For example, I've spent some time there. I know that Argentina has the basic science to do a vaccine at the preclinical level. Countries like Brazil or Mexico has similar capabilities. Countries like Colombia, for example, they have the ability to do clinical testing of a vaccine. In fact, they have a service industry that provide that kind of logistical support for foreign companies that want to test a vaccine or a drug in Colombia. And there are a number of companies across Latin America that are capable of producing small molecule drugs, biologic drugs, and that can quickly switch that capabilities to manufacture a vaccine. What Latin America, however, where only a few countries, only a handful of countries in Latin America actually have the three of these things together, right? And the few Latin American countries that can do all of these three things, all of them, in my view, lack what they all have is a deficit in collaboration. Even though they have the ability to do these things, pulling together all those capabilities in a way that is quick and efficient is really hard in countries in Latin America. Cuba has capabilities to do all of these three things, and also the ability to coordinate these sectors and to build quick partnerships in order to launch a project like a vaccine for COVID-19. But also they have done this before. Cuba has experience in the development of vaccines for meningitis B, for hepatitis B. Most of the vaccines that are required in Cuba are actually manufactured locally, and Cuba is capable of exporting vaccines to a number of countries. In addition to that, Cuba has some specific know-how on developing vaccines for example, particular formulations of vaccines. I highlight here the intranasal administration of drugs and vaccines, which they have done before, and creates a number of public health advantages when you formulate a drug or a vaccine for intranasal administration, including the fact that it might not be necessary to have a health worker administering a vaccine when it can be done intranasally, and also in addition to the systemic immune response that a vaccine is supposed to generate when it is administered through the intranasal way, it creates an additional local immune response. And being the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a virus that enters through the nose, then that is a very important advantage. So, having this know-how and basic science capability and manufacturing capabilities, I think was one of the motivations that the Cuban had to develop their vaccine. Another reason, in my view, for why Cuba decided to do a vaccine is because they actually anticipated that there were going to be an inequitable distribution globally of the vaccine if there were any vaccine developed. So advocates like me were calling early last year for the open sharing of the know-how and open licensing of the patents required to manufacture vaccines in order to pool the manufacturing capacity globally and meet a global demand that no one company was going to be able to meet. We have been painfully reminded this year almost every day that was indeed the case, that open sharing of know-how and open licensing of intellectual property was going to be required. This is one of the reasons we believe for why the rollout of the vaccine has been so slow so far and so inequitable globally. I believe that Cuba anticipated that was going to be the case, and that the possibility of perhaps getting technology transferred to them so that they can use their manufacturing capacity was not going to be an option. It was not going to happen. And in addition to that, we saw last year that a number of countries like the United States and Canada decided to jump into the front of the global vaccine distribution line through, for example, massive procurement agreements with the pharmaceutical companies. And developing countries like Cuba were not going to be able to compete on those terms with the United States. And so, so they were not going to be neither in front of the line nor in the middle of the line, and probably maybe not even at the at the bottom of the line. And so, so that led them to I think that was a big motivation to start a COVID-19 vaccine project. If it works, which seems like it will, then it means that they were right, because they are not only going to be able to vaccinate their people, they're going to do it probably before most countries in the world. We're going to be talking about the timeline of the vaccine shortly. And the third motivation that I've identified for the local development of a COVID-19 vaccine is this idea of technological sovereignty and also national pride. In May 2020, the president of Cuba told, that he meets with scientists, I believe, every week. And one of those weekly meetings, the scientists were briefing the president about their development, and the president told them, aunque hayan vacunas de otros países, nosotros necesitamos la nuestra para tener soberanía. Even if other countries had developed vaccines, we need our vaccines in order to have our sovereignty. So clearly, sovereignty was a huge motivation for the development and this idea of technological sovereignty, not to state the obvious, but the two vaccines that are being developed by the Finland Institute are called soberana, or sovereignty, right? I should point that this is not a new perspective. Before, when the biopharmaceutical industry was created with the leadership of Fidel Castro in the 80s, one of the key motivations was this idea of technological sovereignty. And I should also point that this is not a unique perspective. Latin American countries from time to time called this idea of technological sovereignty and implement policies in order to develop some technological sovereignty. I've seen those policies, for example, in Argentina. What has happened historically is that there has been, political interruptions in those processes, and those, projects and policies are interrupted, and so, there's whatever progress is made is stopped or slowed down. But there has been an attempt to do that, to achieve that technological sovereignty in other countries in Latin America. One example in the context of COVID-19 is Mexico, which says that they want to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. And if they do, they're going to call it Patria, right? So the same branding trend that the Soberana vaccines currently have. And the national pride is another factor, I believe, that is a motivation for the Cubans. We have seen all the coverage, recent coverage in major newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that has a huge echo in Cuba, right? That's a source of national pride. We have seen. I was listening to a song 2 days ago from two popular Cuban artists about the Cuban vaccine, right? This has generated a lot of excitement locally. The idea that they can actually, join the race for COVID-19 vaccine globally. So I want to share this really brief timeline of the development of the COVID-19 vaccines in Cuba. The Cuban institutes, both the Finland Institute and the Center for Biotechnology and Genetic Engineering, they were both working on COVID-19 technology and science early in the pandemic. So in a televised interview from April 13, both institutes explained that they were working on the basic science and trying to repurpose older drugs for COVID-19 to see if they could be used for as a treatment for COVID-19, and also they were trying to repurpose older vaccines to see if they could create an immune response that could help fight COVID-19. In May, the president of Cuba met with the both institute, like I mentioned just a few minutes before, and told them that phrase about the need to develop a local vaccine, even if it was later than the others, but for national sovereignty. And so both institutes decide to and believe that they have to actually accelerate their efforts to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. I want to, well, there's I translated this phrase, and I want to show you a video of this. One of the deputy director of the Finland Institute explained that meeting with the president of Cuba, saying that when they ended the meeting, they all went back to the office and say, well, we need to change everything that we were doing, because obviously there was a gap between how we were designing and defining the projects, even in the context of a pandemic, which we knew was an emergency situation, and the call that we had received from the country's highest authority. And there was one variable that we had to modify, which was time. So clearly, he explains that after that meeting, they decided to move faster and to take a sense of urgency, a bigger sense of urgency to develop this COVID-19 vaccines locally. And I want to share a short video of that explanation in Spanish.
Ese fue un encuentro que se preparó sobre la base de que las instituciones que estábamos participando en los proyectos de vacuna específica hiciéramos nuestra presentación de proyectos. Después tuvimos un intercambio con el presidente de la República, y al final el presidente de la República entonces fue que nos llamó a ese combate que el profe explicaba anteriormente, y definió que este era un tema de soberanía para el país. Y eso realmente, cuando terminó la reunión, yo recuerdo que salimos todos, nos fuimos a la oficina, llegamos a la oficina y dijimos, tenemos que cambiar todo lo que estamos haciendo. Porque obviamente había una diferencia de cómo uno diseña y define los proyectos, incluso en el contexto de pandemia, que sabíamos que era un contexto de urgencia, con el llamado que habíamos recibido por la máxima dirección del país. Y había una variable que nosotros teníamos que tener la capacidad de modificar, y era la variable tiempo. Y eso implicaba un gran reto.
Yeah, so he clearly, he explained how that meeting changed the way they were thinking about developing that vaccine. And so just 3 months after that meeting, in August 24, the Finland Institute launches their first, their clinical trial for their first COVID-19 candidate, Soberana 1. So just very quickly after that, after that meeting, and just jumping incredibly fast from preclinical development to clinical trials. And then Soberana 2 launches clinical trial in November, becomes the front runner, because there were data suggesting that this different formulation of Soberana was potentially going to be better than Soberana 1. And then the Center for Genetic Engineer and Biotechnology launches trials, phase 1 and phase 2 for their first 1 trial for their 2 candidates. And then in January and March, Soberana jumps to phase 2 and then phase 3. And now where we are is that Soberana is approved for a interventional clinical trial with 150,000 volunteers. It is a large clinical trial that includes a lot of health workers. Abdallah has also entered phase 3 clinical trials. And it seems from reporting that it's possible that both Soberana and Abdallah will start a much larger clinical trial soon, because I believe that Cuba is taking the clinical trial as part of the rollout of their vaccine, which is something that is being done in other countries too. So just another point about this timeline. If you go to the Milken Institute vaccine tracker, you can find that, as of 2 days ago, there were 252 vaccines in development, and at least 70 of those vaccines were already in clinical testing. So, and I've done research of my own on Latin America, and I have found at least, or rather over 30 candidates for COVID-19 vaccines that are in preclinical testing. So even though the fact that Cuba was able to launch clinical trials and develop a vaccine itself is an interesting and impressive achievement, I think it's not the most impressive aspect of this. I think the most interesting and impressive aspect is the fact that they were able to do it so quickly, right? Because other countries are also able to do, to develop a vaccine that show good data at the preclinical level, but none were able to jump so quickly to clinical testing within 3 or 4 months. And I think that one of the reasons that explain that move from preclinical to clinical, there are 2 critical factors that I can think of. One of is the open collaboration among all of the actors in the biopharmaceutical industry in Cuba, which are collaborating together in the context of the Bio-Cuba Pharma Alliance, which was pre-existing before COVID-19, and is a way for them to, they collaborate there in a way that is informal and fast and agile. And another, I think, factor that was important was the sharing of data and know-how among the different scientific institutions in Cuba. I think those are really important factors. I'm going to bring again a quote from the deputy director of the Finland Institute saying about open collaboration and sharing of the know-how. He says that the Biopharma Cuba established and articulated a system of knowledge creation and exchange at the organizational level, which was one of the elements that contributed the most to the visualization of possible candidates. And he further adds that the Finland Institute and the Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology were both of which were working on vaccines. They were exchanging knowledge and results among each other, and they were articulating their results. I want to bring that quote, that video when he mentions that.
La Cuba Pharma estableció y articuló un sistema de generación de conocimiento, de intercambio y de avance a nivel de organización que realmente se consideró prioridad número uno, pero además yo considero que fue uno de los elementos que más aportó en el avance de visualizar los posibles cambios. De hecho, en la mesa redonda, en otros espacios, ha venido el Centro de Ingeniería Genética y Biotecnología y ha presentado sus proyectos, lo cual le da una fortaleza al sistema. Primero, porque estos proyectos intercambian entre ellos conocimientos, resultados, articulan de alguna manera todos sus resultados, pero por otra parte, además, va generando apuestas.
Yeah, so again, this idea of open sharing and open collaboration, it seems to be perceived even by their own scientists as a very important factor for the development of their vaccines. And this, I should emphasize again, is a remarkable difference from how pharmaceutical companies out, in other countries typically work, which involves secrecy and lack of collaboration. And when there is some collaboration, it involves massive agreements, typically involves massive agreement for licensing of intellectual property and know-how. So the absence of those really complex, really expensive way of transaction costs, I think was an important factor for the quick development of Cuban vaccine candidates. And it allowed the Biopharma Cuba Alliance and the sharing of the information and sharing of the results and the know-how allowed the different Cuban institutions to fine-tune their candidates as they were progressing another thing that the scientists have said is that something that typically lasts 5 years, that take 5 years to develop, we had to do it in 5 months. So we had to fine tune everything with this type of coordination. I want to jump now to the last part of my presentation, which is about the commercial strategy and the possibility for scaling the vaccine in Cuba. So what we know so far, and what I've tried to explain is, these are vaccines that were developed with an open collaboration, an open knowledge perspective. Cuba has a long history of international collaboration, and obviously the Cuban population will receive the vaccine for free. And it's possible that other countries outside of, other countries will be receiving some doses of the Cuban vaccine. At least that seems to be part of the intent. So I want to share this quote from the director of the Finland Institute, Vicente Vélez Bencomo, who says that the Cuban strategy for the commercialization of the vaccine is a strategy that has a combination on the first place, humanity and health impact, and second, on the need that our industry has to sustain the production of vaccines and drugs for the country. Therefore, we are not a multinational company, or we're not a multinational where profit is the #1 goal, and generating more health is a consequence. We work the other way around. For us, the goal is generating more health, and profit is a consequence of generating health. Profit is never the priority. And this is the last video that I want to share, but I think it's important to hear these words, even if they are in Spanish. I think it's important to hear them from the actors themselves.
La estrategia de Cuba de comercializar la vacuna es una estrategia que tiene una combinación, en primer lugar, de humanidad y de impacto en salud, y en segundo lugar, en la necesidad que tiene nuestro sistema empresarial de sostener la producción de vacunas y de medicamentos para el país. Y por lo tanto, nosotros eterno es la razón #1 de sobrevida. Nosotros crear más salud es una consecuencia. Nosotros decimos que nosotros funcionamos al revés. Para nosotros es crear más salud y el retorno es una consecuencia de crear más salud. Nunca va a ser la prioridad.
So one has to question if this is a vaccine that will be free to the Cuban people, if this is a vaccine that has been developed with the open science ideas, if this is a country that has a history of international collaboration and international solidarity in relates to with regard to health, then one has to question: is this the people's vaccine that we have been calling for a long time? Is this a vaccine that will be available to all for free and with the open sharing of the know-how, so that the manufacturing can be scaled up quickly? And what you see here is a tweet from Fabricio Chiodo, who is one of the leading scientists in the development of the Finland Institute vaccines. And he's saying that, well, he's suggesting at least that the Cuban vaccines are indeed the people's vaccines. And again, by the people's vaccines, I think that he is referring to, in part, to a campaign where Knowledge Ecology International and also others like Oxfam and Public Citizen, among other advocates, have been working on, which is a vaccine that is available to all everywhere for free of charge, right? And so will the Cuban actually be that people's vaccine? We hope so, right? There are some challenges. The Cuban biopharmaceutical industry has this, in my view, and based on my research, the manufacturing capacity to meet the national demand. There have been differing quotes and statements about how many doses Cuba can actually produce. For example, in January, Beres Bencosmo said that they were planning to produce about 100 million doses this year. He also told The Lancet more recently that by the end of the summer, Cuba will have the capacity to produce about 10 million doses per month. So, maybe 100, 120 million doses a year. But also there are other, statements suggesting much less production capacity that is smaller. For example, Eduardo Ojito, he told to the NPR that they had the capacity to produce about 1 or 2 million doses each month. In any case, it does seems to be that Cuba will be able to have sufficient doses to vaccinate their whole population this year. That seems to be the case. It's worth pointing out that Cuba has been producing vaccines in part for the clinical trials, but also preparing for a larger rollout of the vaccines. They have been doing that since, I believe, since February. And so you would imagine that they have already a large stockpile of vaccines produced already. And so it does seems to be likely that they will have that capacity for the population, which is about 11 million people. And this year, most of them or all of them, if their vaccine actually work, most of them will be vaccinated. What will be more challenging is for the Cuban manufacturing capacity to be used to also export to other countries. Right? If there's 100 million doses produced, then most of those doses will be dedicated to their own population. I should note that the Cuban vaccines will be most likely a 2-dose or 3-dose vaccines. Some of the clinical trials that they are implementing right now suggests that a 3rd dose will actually bring the levels of seroconversion to above 90%, which is positive, but also means that instead of 2 doses, they will have to do 3. And if that is the case, then 100 million doses means that somewhere around 35 or 40 million doses will have to stay in Cuba, and depending on how much they want to stockpile, right? So exporting 60 million doses it will be an important achievement, but also not enough to, for example, vaccinate Vietnam or Iran, which are some of the countries that have shown interest in the Cuban vaccine. One good thing, however, about all of this is that the Cuban vaccine, which are based on a protein subunit platform, they are, quote unquote, very easy to manufacture. So companies around the world that have capabilities to do, and this is based on conversation that we have had with one of the leading scientists behind the development of the Cuban vaccines. He says that any company that has pre-existing capabilities for API production, for small molecule production, or even for biologics should have the ability to manufacture the Cuban vaccines. And the transfer of the technology and the know-how from Cuba to any other company that has some pre-existing capability is something that is very easy to do. There are many companies out there that are still not producing COVID-19 vaccines. This is what our research suggests. We have been working on a database of those countries, and there's a list of countries companies that can do that, including companies that specialize in protein subunit in particular. So the Cuba can use that unused manufacturing capacity to scale up their vaccines. If they do that, it can happen fairly quickly. My own research suggests that the experience from the technology transfer of other vaccines. Between the transfer of technology and the start of the manufacturing, there is a gap of something around 4 to 6 months. So if the if the Cuban Institute decide to transfer their know-how to the companies that are not yet producing vaccines, this year the Cuban can scale up the manufacturing of the vaccine, and they can potentially meet at least part of the global demand for vaccines. Obviously, there are countries around the world that are not expecting vaccines, or at least not sufficient vaccines to protect the whole population this year or even in 2023. So the potential that Cuba can actually participate in that global distribution of the vaccine, I think, is really exciting. Just one last point before I conclude, and I'm excited to hear your question and your comments. One mechanism that Cuba can use, we believe, to scale up their manufacturing capacity is the CTAP, a mechanism within the context of the World Health Organization that was created last year to allow for the open sharing of the intellectual property and the know-how around vaccines and other health technologies, and to connect the owners of intellectual property and the developers of the know-how with manufacturers, generic manufacturers across the world. It's a mechanism that is currently at the WHO has not generated any license, any open sharing yet. But we are advocating for that to happen. And I think it is interesting because of all the history that I described of the Cuban vaccines, the open sharing, the history of open sharing locally. I think it is a possibility that Cuba might be interested in making their vaccine a global public good. I'm going to conclude there, and I welcome your questions and your comments.
Larry or Frank, for some reason my video won't start. Apparently you got to open it somehow. Hello?
Gary, I think you should be able to do it now.
Okay, I'm having trouble elsewhere, but let's see. There we go. Okay. Thank you. Well, Louise, thank you. I've been having problems with my screen, but I got most of it and I really appreciate it. Very informative. There are a couple outstanding questions still. Let me just bring them up. For those who are watching, there's a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions there. This is from Lorenzo Perez. Lorenzo is the secretary of ASCE. Let's hope the clinical trials prove the vaccine effective. But there is the problem of getting the basic inputs, containers for vaccines and the caps to produce the vaccines. 14 Medio has an article today pointing out that may limit production. Louise, can you make a comment on this?
Just not very insightful, probably. I think I've been hearing scientists in Cuba and officials in Cuba commenting about difficulties relating to accessing the raw materials and other things that they need to scale up the production of the vaccine. I think the obvious factor there is the embargo. yeah, and it seems that it might be a challenge. I think there should be a more reasonable approach, at least in the context of a pandemic, where companies should be allowed to, to partner with Cuba in order to scale up something so necessary as a vaccine. Assuming that clinical trials prove them effective and other things. I should point, I'm not, like I said in the beginning of my presentation, an expert on Cuba. I am not an expert on the embargo itself. I do believe that there are people in this audience that probably have more insightful comments than me in that regard.
In other countries, are they getting their vaccine vials and so on from the US, or are they manufacturing them elsewhere? Because the embargo only refers to US exports.
Yeah, so I don't know where they're getting the vials from. I do think that there's a history, for example, where GlaxoSmithKline was trying to partner with one of the Cuban institutes to distribute a vaccine that they had developed. This is a history from 20 years ago, or rather, 20 years ago. Even though GlaxoSmithKline not being a company based in the United States, because they had some link to the United States, they had to go through the state to the department, to the Treasury Department, and so that made things more complicated. I don't have much background on how it works and what really are the challenges. I keep hearing from statements from the Cuban scientists and officials that that is a challenge. Of course, in addition to things like the embargo, I think there's been a scarcity because of the scaling up of production of vaccines have been challenging in general, not only in Cuba. I think some of those challenges are more generally applicable to not just to Cuba, but rather to other countries.
Okay, from Natalia Delgado. Can Cuba manufacture vaccine using manufacturing capacity in other countries without losing its intellectual property rights pursuant to some sort of legal or operational mechanism?
Yeah, I think absolutely. There are ways to enter into licensing agreement that not only will require for Cuba to retain some of their intellectual property, and I should point, I believe it is my understanding that at least part of the technology that is embedded into the Cuban vaccine is already subject to patent applications. That is my understanding. So they will have patents likely in Cuba and potentially in other countries to protect the Cuban vaccines. What we think that can happen is that they can license those patents globally to allow for the scale up of the manufacturing, and also, by the way, sharing of the know-how and the intellectual property doesn't mean that they will gonna give it away for free. Some of the mechanisms that allow for this open sharing actually, or all of the mechanisms that allow for some form of remuneration, which I think should happen. I don't know why should Cuba give away their technology for free. Nobody, all the companies are not doing that. So nobody's asking Cuba to, at least not me, is asking Cuba to give it away for free. I think they should probably have some to profit from this, and that can definitely happen in the context of the licensing agreement.
Okay, from David Ramirez. How does collaboration in creating a vaccine in Cuba differ from other countries in Latin America and the US?
Yeah, so what I've been hearing, for example, in Argentina, is that there are, in Mexico and Brazil, there are candidates that have been found already. By candidates, I mean specific proteins that is showing in preclinical testing on animals that they can elicit an immune response. And in some cases, in the case, for example, I'm aware of one case in Mexico where in May, they already had a candidate that was May last year was showing in preclinical testing that was creating an immune response. So it could have jumped into clinical trials at least summer last year, and as of now, it has still not entered clinical trials. And I think the difference there is that in Mexico, there's no, or that particular project has not found a private partner that can allow them to scale up the what it is now still sort of a basic science and scale that to a clinical trial, which requires a number of doses being produced. And so that partnership, the way they're trying to collaborate with the private sector, and they have not been able to do it yet. So that is because of Cuba has the Bio-Cuba Pharma Alliance, and all of the vaccines effort has been done in the context of the Bio-Cuba Pharma Alliance. I think that sort of partnership has happened way faster than in other countries. And the other, I think, major difference has been the sharing of the know-how. A lot of the research groups in the United States or other Latin American countries, which are when you asking your question, are working on the secrecy basis, right? So sharing very little know-how and very little information about the results, and that just makes fine-tuning and adapting more difficult. I'm not saying that every research group works like that, but I believe that's sort of the norm. In Cuba, like the video that I show, the norm was to fine-tune the development of the vaccine candidates based on sharing of know-how and open collaboration. And I think that's a remarkable difference from other countries.
Great. I have a personal question myself. Well, and maybe I missed it, but is Cuba seeking international certification for its vaccine at WHO or whatever the international bodies are that certify a clinical trials have been a success?
I think they are, yeah. I think they're trying to achieve that. I don't have a lot of details on that, but I believe that's part of the goal.
Okay. I just asked because I think there's always suspicion about what comes out of Cuba, to what extent they're willing to rush the process simply for the prestige. So, okay. What kind of manufacturing facility is needed for production of Cuban vaccines?
Yeah, so it is my understanding, based on conversations with Cuban scientists on this issue, that so if there's a company out there that can do a small molecule drug, which are very common in Latin America, this kind of facilities. So Argentina has some of those, Mexico has facilities like that, in Brazil and in other countries. Those facilities can be used to develop to manufacture a Cuban vaccine. So there's a possibility for the Cubans to partner with a number of companies and that already have these facilities. You know, the details are something that escaped my understanding, but what I do know is that these facilities are rather common.
Right. Okay. So I'm having trouble here, but anyway, give me a second. Disponibility. What's the availability of the vaccine in Central America and especially in Guatemala?
Yeah, so the Cuban vaccines are still candidates. They has not been approved for commercialization. They're still in the context of a clinical trial. If you want to get a Cuban vaccines, you have to participate in the clinical trial in Cuba. I don't know if anyone that is not a Cuban can do that. I just don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's not yet available outside of the context of a clinical trial, which are happening in Cuba. I would imagine that is the interest of the Cuban government to make the vaccine available in places like Latin America and in Central America, including Guatemala. I would imagine that that's part of the objective. And like I said, Cuba has a history of exporting vaccines to other countries including in the Central America region.
Okay. And final question from the audience. I may have one or two of my own, and people are still, we still have time if anybody, we got plenty of time if anybody wants to ask more questions. Any info that the Biden administration is willing to work with Cuba for the vaccine production?
Yeah, I don't have any information on one way or the other. I think it's arguably in the interest of the Biden administration to work with any country and any research institute that is producing an effective vaccine, including Cuba, to scale up the global manufacturing capacity in order to distribute vaccines globally. Of course, you know, everybody knows that nobody is safe until everyone is safe, right? This is a global pandemic. And so strengthening the capacity in Cuba for vaccine production is actually in the best interest, in my view, in the best interest of the United States. I do remember about a month and a half or so that Anthony Fauci in the US, he was asked the questions about the vaccines being produced in China and Russia, and how he felt about them. And he said, well, this is not a race. Everyone should win. Everyone should be able to develop a vaccine, because the more vaccines that are out there, the more tool we have as a global society to fight the pandemic. And I think I was a bit disappointed that in that statement, he did not mention Cuba. He highlighted the Chinese and the Russian vaccine, which, you know, if proven safe, should also be scaled up and supported globally. But I also believe that, you know, the Cubans should be among those vaccines if they are, again, if they are proven effective among those vaccines that the Biden administration should be working with to scale up the production.
Okay, there was a question earlier. Maybe it was asked and I didn't get it. I can't find it at the moment. Wait a minute. Oh, here we go. Andres Hernandez. Oh, here we go. More questions. You're very popular. Good work, Luis. Andres Hernandez. Cuba reports unbelievable numbers every single day about the death count and the infection rate. No more than 4 people have been reported dead in a day. Why should we believe about their vaccines, infection rates, or death?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the general policy related to COVID-19, the general response. I would know that I remember seeing a few months ago some epidemiological reports where with anonymity for the name, but a lot of details in terms of like the actual, you know, the address and citizenship and of the people that were infected, and this was reported to with a lot of detail in the I believe it was in the Ministry of Science website. I don't, you know, take whatever, make whatever conclusions you want about that. Like I said, I'm not familiar with that part of the response. You know, I think all countries should be transparent about things like that. I don't know if Cuba should be singled out as a good example or bad example.
Okay, David Ramirez asked, are they working on more than one vaccine? I think you've answered that. The answer is yes. I have a question. What type of vaccines are they working on? Are these mRNA vaccines or are they some other process?
Yeah, so Cuba has a long history of working with something that is called a protein subunit vaccine. It's not an mRNA. It's a platform that has been used before outside of Cuba and within Cuba for the development of vaccines. it is my understanding of the science that they take a particle of a protein and attach that to another protein that will elicit an immune response, and they attach those things together, and introduce that to the patient. It's not an attenuated vaccine, but it's also not an mRNA vaccine. Nevertheless, it is a platform that has been used before and proven safe for as a vaccine platform. And the Cubans, and the Cubans have done it before. The Cubans has worked on protein subunit before.
I'm just very impressed. The science has progressed so far that everybody was able to come up with vaccines so quickly. Does the Cuban vaccine require refrigeration?
I believe that it can survive for a long time in room temperature. So compared to the mRNA vaccines, it has a much favorable refrigeration profile. And that makes sense because these are vaccines that are developed thinking of Cuba as the primary consumer of those vaccines. The mRNA vaccines would have been probably being really incredibly challenging to distribute because of those refrigeration requirements. So because of the refrigeration profile for the Cuban vaccine, but also the potential of having this intranasal administration, I think that countries, least developed countries and developing countries in the region and also in other regions are interested in the Cuban vaccine for those reasons. I've been hearing that from other countries that the intranasal and the refrigeration profile has generated interest there.
Okay, and do we have any suggestion of the duration of the immunity?
No, I don't think that's known neither in Cuba and probably not known for other platforms for other vaccines, because the data about the duration of the immunity can only come once the clinical trials are old enough to analyze that data, and none of the clinical trials are over like a year old, and so yeah, I think the Cuban don't know that, and probably nobody knows that yet about the duration of the immunity.
And then questions keep coming. This is the last question at the moment. What is the process for determining whether a vaccine is safe or effective?
Yeah, so typically a vaccine is first developed at the preclinical level. Once you have a particular protein or molecule that you think might work, once you understand the mechanism of a virus and you can develop that molecule or protein. And so that is tested first in animals, basically to figure out if it's going to be safe, and also if it might show some immune response in animals. And then it jumps to 3 stages of development that are at the clinical level, which is a small trial. In the case of vaccines, just a few hundred people are given a vaccine to show that it is safe. If no critical adverse effects occur, then that jumps into a phase 2 trial with a larger population. In the case of vaccines, typically around the thousands, that in order to show that the vaccine is effective, and also that this larger population is also safe after having received a vaccine. And then it jumps to phase 3 trials. 2 of the Cuban vaccine, Abdala and Soberana 2, are currently in that particular phase, the phase 3 trials. And that is the last step before a health authority like the FDA or CIECTI in Cuba will authorize the vaccine based on the data from, the safety data, but also the efficacy data. In normal times, this whole process typically takes years. What is remarkable in the context of COVID-19 is it has happened within a year, and it's remarkable in Cuba, but also with regards to other technologies.
Well, that's it on the questions, I think. I just want to thank you again very much for your presentation. This is part of an ASCE series of webinars on many topics, usually dealing with the Cuban economy, but this was a particularly great opportunity to have you here, answer a lot of questions that I think all of us have had about how Cuba is doing. And I thank you very much. To the audience, I want to say thank you for participating. You can send me, I'll put something on when I leave, an email if you have any further questions or comments about the presentation or about ASCE in general. ASCE does have its General Assembly meeting coming up in August, and we hope some of you will, who are not members yet, will join. We'll probably have more on COVID at that General Assembly. There'll be a live meeting in Miami, we hope, if things go as well as we expect on the vaccines. So again, Luis, thank you very much. I want to thank Frank Martinez, who has been there in the background, keeping us all safe, and to Larry Katabaka, who I think is now off the air, but who
Now I'm back.
well, you're back, who sets up the whole operation for us from the Penn State University. And I guess that's not a wig, that's your real hair, right?
Yeah, it can be a wig. I was thinking of donating it.
Larry, by the way, is probably the preeminent or one of the preeminent scholars on Chinese and Cuban Communist Party ideology. And we depend on him heavily for interpreting events in Cuba. So to all of you, thank you again. And we hope you come back for future ASCE presentations. You can keep checking on our website for what's coming next. I hope to have 2 more before our annual meeting, but I can't announce them yet because they're still working on it. Okay, well, thanks again to everybody, Louise, everyone, and I wish you all a happy rest of the day and an Easter weekend.
Thank you.